Star Wars only, I don't know what the fuck your problem is.
They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway, but at the same time I said, I'm not going to, if I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble because they're not going to do what I want them to do. So, and I don't have the control to do that anymore, and all I would do is muck everything up. So I said, okay, I will go my way and I'll let them go their way.
It's been no secret that George Lucas was not fond of the direction Disney decided to take the Star Wars sequel trilogy. But the comments from Lucas about the new Star Wars films have always been a little bit vague, with one word or one sentence statements. Finally, we have more clarity about the situation when Disney bought Lucasfilm, and we get that clarity from a new book by Disney CEO Bob Iger. And in this book, he talks about buying Lucasfilm from George and the reaction that Lucas had when he learned his story treatments weren't being used for the new films, and his reaction to seeing The Force Awakens for the first time. We have a lot to get to and to talk about in this video, so let's discuss how this all came to be. Before selling Lucasfilm to Disney, George was in the early stages of starting the sequel trilogy. He had written story treatments for the new films. When deciding if it was time for him to step away from Star Wars and let someone else helm the new films, George sent over story treatments to Bob Iger and others at Disney. Here's what the book says about it from the perspective of Bob Iger. At some point in the process, George told me that he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines, one for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who had just been hired to run our studio. Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made it clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he laid out. The next quote from the book talks about George's creative consultant role with the new deal. Bob says he knew I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept, and so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas. That was not a hard promise to make. Of course we'd be open to George Lucas's ideas. But like the outlines, we would be under no obligation. Now so far it sounds like Lucas thought with the purchase of his story treatments that he believed Disney would use his outlines for the sequel trilogy. Remember, Lucas was around 70 years old at the time, so it's understandable that he didn't want to take on 3 new Star Wars movies and instead wanted to pass them onto someone else. And the story that Lucas was going for in his versions of episodes 7, 8, and 9 focused on a young protagonist dealing with the microbiotic universe in Star Wars, focusing on the Wills, which have always been a very mysterious part of the Star Wars mythos since the 70s. Now the next part of the book is when things get really rocky, and you can see the disappointment of Lucas start to set in. Bob Iger in this section talks about when they went to Lucas to discuss the ideas for the new Star Wars trilogy, and here's what Bob has to say. Early on, Kathy brought JJ and Michael Arden up to Northern California to meet with George at his ranch and talk about their ideas for the film. George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that we weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiation. The truth was, Kathy, JJ, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better, and I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him. Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed, and while the whole process would have never been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start.
You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun, and you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way.
What I find interesting about this is that J.J. Abrams has said in the past that the decision to step away from the story treatments that Lucas wrote happened before J.J. Abrams was brought on to direct. And don't forget, J.J. met with Lucas privately to discuss the story for the films. I think J.J. understood that George was upset, and he tried to mend things a little bit by meeting with him and using some of the story ideas that Lucas had outlined. But I don't think JJ ever got to read the story treatments from Lucas. Remember, Bob just said there was only 3 scripts that he sent out. But let's read the final piece of the book about this subject and the reaction that George had to a private screening of The Force Awakens. The book says, just prior to the global release, Kathy screened The Force Awakens for George. He didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new, he said. In each of the films in the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies. In this one, he said, there weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward. He wasn't wrong. but he also wasn't appreciating the pressure we were under to give ardent fans a film that felt quintessentially Star Wars. We'd intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films, to not stray too far from what people loved and expected. And George was criticizing us for the very thing we were trying to do. Looking back with the perspective of several years and a few more Star Wars films, I believe JJ achieved the near impossible, creating a perfect bridge between what had been and what was to come. It was often speculated that Disney intentionally moved away from the prequels when they created the new Star Wars films due to the fan reactions to them back in the early 2000s. Now we have confirmation that they tried to appeal to general audiences and also Star Wars fans that were looking for the original trilogy feel to these new films. And I think it's kind of funny to hear Bob Iger say that Disney had a lot of pressure from die-hard Star Wars fans and George wasn't appreciating that, when that's exactly what Lucas had to deal with in 1999 when he released The Phantom Menace. This is where you see the difference in the mindset of a businessman like Bob Iger and the mindset of a movie maker, a filmmaker like George Lucas. George wanted to create the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and the sequel trilogy, and have them all be connected by their stories while not doing the same film over and over again, and by offering new generations of fans and moviegoers a different experience for every Star Wars trilogy. I remember a few months back, I said one of my biggest criticisms for the sequel trilogy is that they aren't innovative films. The original trilogy changed film forever. It revolutionized the film industry. It had strides in technology with never-before-seen special effects, and also new camera systems. The prequel trilogy was also the dawn of digital filmmaking, and it's so common today that people hardly even link it back to George Lucas and the prequels. George Lucas is an innovative filmmaker who likes to be in complete, total control of his movies, so it's gotta hurt to build a company and a movie franchise from the ground up. You run it for 40 years, you create new Star Wars films that, despite their flaws and reaction from the fans, were brand new and innovative for their time. Then you sell that company with the hopes that they finish the story that you started, only to see them throw it out the window and go in a different direction and just copy the work that you did 40 years ago. Hell, who wouldn't be disappointed? Why the hell sell the franchise if you're just gonna redo your work and you could easily do that yourself, you know? Lucas really believed that with the purchase of his story treatments, Disney would use that to finish the story that he started in the Star Wars saga. And I'll admit, I think it was a mistake to throw out the outlines that Lucas gave for the sequel trilogy. I think Lucas learned from his mistakes with the prequels, and you could have possibly had a better story that expands the Star Wars mythology if they used the story that Lucas outlined. My big question now is, would George have sold the franchise if he knew Disney was not going to use his story treatments? It seems clear that yet again, a lack of proper communication led to a lot of unneeded conflict. If Bob Iger had told George before the purchase of Lucasfilm that he wasn't going to use the outlines Lucas created, would George still have sold the company? George was already torn on selling the company in the first place and constantly went back and forth on his decisions. He really didn't know if he wanted to sell the franchise or not. It seems like Lucas really believed that Disney was going to use his outlines and story treatments for the sequel trilogy, and that's why he gave in to selling the company. That's why he gave in to selling Star Wars and letting someone else take the reins, because he thought they were going to finish the story he started. Crazy to finally have more clarity on the Star Wars sequels, just a few months before it ends with the rise of Skywalker. I'll sadly spend the rest of my life wondering if George Lucas would have sold the franchise if he knew they wouldn't follow his story. He was getting ready to create his own versions of episodes 7, 8, and 9, but unlike the prequels, Lucas would not have written and directed all three of them. So in an attempt to keep his story alive and his company afloat, he sold Lucasfilm, only to later realize it wasn't the deal he thought it was. Another situation that Star Wars fans have of what could have been. What could have been if Lucas knew they weren't going to use his treatments? Would he have negotiated something different? Would he have been completely okay with it and just let the franchise go? It was time for something to change in the Star Wars universe, no matter what. We all knew when the prequels came out there was going to be a 7, 8, 9. It was never an open statement, but it was always kind of that subconscious understanding. Everyone knew there was going to be a 7, 8, 9. The question would be, who would it be from? Would it be from someone like Disney or Warner Bros? Would Lucas sell the franchise basically, or would he do it himself? And I think the answer is clear. I think he would have done it himself if he knew the story that he created would have been the ending to the Star Wars saga. And my heart goes out to Lucas on this one. I would be really disappointed if I sold my franchise thinking that they would finish the story that I started, only to come back to discuss the next movie and realize, oh, you guys didn't like anything that I did. You guys didn't want to use any of my treatments. What the fuck? yeah, it's reasonable to be disappointed and be upset and feel a little betrayed in that situation. And it really seems like Disney, not Lucasfilm, I'm not even going to say Kathleen Kennedy in this situation, but Disney didn't understand Star Wars from the word go, didn't understand the property and the franchise that they had on their hands. You're going to throw out the outlines George had, but then you're going to say that the man doesn't appreciate the pressure that you had from the fans on making this new film? What do you mean he doesn't appreciate the pressure? And yeah, he's criticizing you for the very thing you're trying to do. The reason he's doing that is because the thing you're trying to do is not an original idea. It's not filmmaking, which is what George Lucas specializes in. It's not telling a brand new story. It's just retracing the steps of 1977 and then going on to a different story that, I mean, let's be honest, a lot of fans just aren't entirely happy with the direction the sequel trilogy has gone. And it's just disappointing to think about what could have been. What would happen if Lucas had not written and directed all 3 of the sequel films. Instead, he just wrote the stories for them and probably had 3 different directors come in. Maybe he directed one of them. Just changed it up, learned from his mistakes with the prequels, and do something different and innovative. That's another question. How would he have innovated the film industry a 3rd time around? With a new Star Wars trilogy, how would you have changed the way we made films? Yet again, Mr. Lucas. He's an innovator. He's a filmmaker. He's one of the most influential filmmakers that have ever lived. And to think that they just threw out his story ideas because they didn't agree with the direction they were going in, I mean, it really is disappointing. It really is. Just gotta say, man, you know, I'm sorry, George. I'm sorry that he had to go through this. I'm sorry that he was disappointed and kind of caught up guard, a little bamboozled by what Disney did with the story treatments. He really thought that they were going to take that story and evolve it and do something with it, and instead they put it in the trash can and redid what he did in 1977. Tell me your thoughts below. What do you guys think about this large part of the story that was missing that we now have clarity on? What do you think about Lucas and his story treatments for episodes 7, 8, 9 being tossed out and the direction Disney decided to go? So give me your thoughts in the comment section below. Please leave a like because it really does help out the channel. I'll see you all next time, and may the Force be with you, always.